community, not least because of the role it plays in managing migratory flows to Europe, but also in various theaters in Eurasia and Africa. But the aim of this side event is to draw attention to one of the most neglected aspects in Turkish policy, the treatment of the Kurdish people in Turkey, but also in neighboring Syria and Iraq. Although the Office of the High Commissioner examined the human rights violation of the Kurdish people in Turkey by producing a report in 2017 and an update in 2018, since then there has been no update, and yet rights violations are systematic and serious. In its latest report, which it will be presenting to the Council in a few days' time, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria reports a few episodes of violations of Kurdish rights in Syria. But the reality is that Turkey's occupation of northeastern Syria is a source of massive human rights violations and crimes. We are honored today to have with us three eminent experts who will help us to grasp the depth and breadth of the crimes committed by the Turkish state against the Kurdish people. Without any further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Hans-Lukas Kieser, Professor of Modern History at the University of Zurich and President of the Research Foundation Switzerland-Turkey in Basel. He has been a lecturer or invited professor at Stanford University, University of Michigan, and other universities, including the Bamberg University, and invited scholar at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Science in Paris and the Bilgi University in Turkey. He currently lectures as a professor of modern history at the University of Newcastle in Australia. Professor Kieser has published a number of books and articles in several languages on Turkey, the Middle East, and the Balkans. Professor, you have the floor.
Bonjour, thank you. The topic I have been entrusted to speak about today is the historical matrix of the human rights violations and crimes against Kurds in Turkey and beyond. The First World War and the subsequent Anatolia Wars had carried extreme violence into the genesis and fabric of Turkish politics. Some Kurds had been involved as victims, others as perpetrators of crimes against humanity, also during the Armenian and Assyrian genocides under the imperial rule of the Young Turks in the 1910s, more than 100 years ago. By 1922, Turkish nationalists had cleansed Asia Minor of most of its indigenous Christians. The Kurds were now the largest minority in the country, but were not even recognized as such by the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. Kemalist Turkey became an iron cage for them. The fallacy of Kemal Atatürk and his circle was the illusion that the Kurds, as Muslims, could be assimilated into an ultra-nationalist polity. The Lausanne Treaty concluded a lasting international pact of silence, as it were, on non-Turkish versions of public history as experienced by Kurds, Armenians, and other non-Turkish indigenous people of Asia Minor. All openings, especially the introduction of a multi-party system after 1945, the new constitution of 1961, and the liberalization of the early 2000s failed to produce the new pluralist order that was needed. Both the Kemalist founding fathers and the Islamists in power since 2002 have clearly failed to meet the challenge of democracy. The basic national self-understanding of the ruling classes was and is that of a unitary, ethno-national, i.e. purely Turkish, and in any case Muslim state. by no means say a binational, federal, plural, polyethnic, or multilingual state. Solving Turkey's Kurdish problem would require robust democratic reforms toward a polity that shares power with all its constituents without fearing and suppressing their ethnic, racial or religious otherness. Otherwise, violence and coercion will sadly prevail also in the future. The well-known secret of democracy is the recognition of ethnic or religious others as legal and political equals, including their cultural self-affirmation. Let us continue now with the present of human rights violations and then go back to the roots and structures that produce them time and again. We cannot understand Turkey's treatment of its Kurds without analyzing the birth of Republican Turkey at the end of the Ottoman Empire, especially at the Lausanne Conference. Currently, we are witnessing a sharp increase in anti-Kurdish repression, human rights violation, and racist acts. This is due to Ankara's descent into an authoritarian coalition of Islamists and ultranationalists in the 2010s. That is Erdogan's party, the AKP, together with the far-right MHP, which has been the AKP's indispensable junior partner since Turkey has lost the fresh democratic orientation it had embraced at the beginning of this century. The AKP-MHP government under Erdogan has destroyed the seeds of democratization of the previous decade, including a so-called Kurdish opening or peace process. The early 2000s had been promising in terms of EU rapprochement, sound search regarding crimes and discrimination against non-Turkish groups, and a more liberal atmosphere in public life, the media and academia. The backlash since the 2010s is all the more painful. The AKP-MHP rulership is afraid of democratic life, especially if Kurds are involved. Since mid-2010s, the human rights violations have increased dramatically and affected the lives of millions of people. Ankara's repression has particularly targeted the dynamic multiculturalism and multilingualism that had begun to flourish under the mainly Kurdish mayorships in the southeastern parts of the country. Repression, though not lethal violence, has reached a level comparable to that of the 1980s and 90s. That is the height of the war waged against the PKK, with hundreds of unaccounted for murders of Kurdish businessmen and intellectuals, the evacuation of villages and forced migration of millions, and the imprisonment and torture of those considered to be associated with the Kurdish movement, so in the late 20th century. The current situation is characterized by unprecedented mass arrests and a regression to the late 20th century in terms of suppressed civil, political and cultural freedoms, as well as the systematic replacement of democratically elected mayors in predominantly Kurdish cities by agents of Ankara. There are many cases showing that even the use of the Kurdish language and listening to Kurdish songs are again being prosecuted, which is a violation of the minimum elementary rights codified in the Lausanne Treaty. Over the past decade, this domestic repression has been closely linked to a synchronized anti-Kurdish policy abroad. Most notably, Turkey has illegally occupied parts of northern Syria over the past few years, such as the peaceful region of Afrin in 2018, expelling and dispossessing the local Kurdish population. Ankara's policy of war, intervention, occupation, and building of military bases goes beyond Syria and Iraq, but it is mainly directed against the Kurds and their ethnically diverse self-organization out of fear of increasing Kurdish prosperity, power, and international recognition. In Syria, the military wing of the Kurdish self-organization is known as the American-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. These are the forces that were instrumental in liberating the region from the terrorism of IS, while Ankara itself maintains close ties with various militant Islamist groups. Since its anti-Kurdish invasion of parts of northern Syria, Turkey has co-opted such gangs as her militias. While they have excelled in human rights violations and war crimes, Ankara itself is directly responsible for the drone killings of Kurdish representatives of the autonomous administration of North and East Syria. Cengiz Çandar and Adem Uzun will talk more in detail about the current situation. Now again back to the historical matrix of the problem. The decisive geographic, diplomatic and political coordinates were set by the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. This is the still valid legal fundament of the Middle East, and as diplomats have called it, the birth certificate of Republican Turkey. Alas, anti-democracy and anti-Kurdish repression were in the DNA of Turkey's birth as a unitary, ethno-national, one-party state at the Conference of Lausanne. In contrast, the stillborn, very unfortunate Paris-Sèvres Treaty of 1920 had envisioned Kurdish self-determination that could evolve into an independent state of Kurds in both southeastern Asia Minor and northern Iraq. Ankara's delegation in Lausanne 101 years ago had to accept minimal minority rights for Turkey's Christian and Jewish citizens, and very few also generally. But it did not recognize a Kurdish identity. It insisted that the Kurds were religious and racial siblings, supposedly of the same Turanian race as the Turks. A few years later, the term Mountain Turks came into use among Turkish nationalists to refer to them. Kurdish culture and language were suppressed, and political aspiration for autonomy crushed in extermination wars in the 1920s and 30s. While the Lausanne Peace pacified international relations of the West with Turkey, it failed to establish societal peace in the former later Core-lands. It made the Kurds borderlanders between Turkey, Iran, Iraq and Syria. In the long term, the former later Core-lands remained areas of protracted crisis, civil wars and even genocides. The most recent is the genocide of the Yazidis during the civil war and the rise of IS in Iraq and Syria. 30 years earlier, other Iraqi Kurds were targeted for extermination by Saddam Hussein's forces, including by poisonous gas. Less well known are the extermination massacres of many more than 10,000 Alevi Kurds in Dersim, a province in Turkey in 1938, where poison gas had been used, and of other Kurdish civilians in Zilan, notably during an uprising in 1930. All this cost the life of many tens of thousands of Kurds during the interwar period and displaced many hundreds of thousands more, some of them fleeing to mandatory Syria, Syria then a French mandate, who settled down there until today. The new borders set by the Lausanne Treaty unmade communities and decomposed formerly continuous spaces, but they also acted as a shield that prevented further persecution of dissident individuals and groups by Turkish forces. Post-Lausanne Western diplomacy remained bound by its primacy of Ankara's appeasement and its welcome of Western-style Kemalist reforms. It ignored human rights right from the start, so that's really in the DNA of the Lausanne Treaty. It ignored human rights violations and Kurdish unrest, which met with continuous repression and forced relocation, the latter in line with previous Young Turk policies. Today, we have not yet, hopefully never, returned to the death toll of the interwar period and the late 20th century. Also, fortunately, the Kurds, their history and their cause are much better known and more visible internationally than in the 20th century. They are much better organized, probably the most important point. More than others in the Middle East, to my sense at least, they seek their salvation in solid democracy. But in terms of human rights, the anti-Kurdish attitude in Turkey and beyond has regressed to those dark times. So the Kurdish future is threatened again.
I thank you, Professor Kiese, for your historical introduction, which helps us to better understand the actual current policy of Turkey towards the Kurdish people. And now we will enter really in the Turkish policy with Mr. Cengiz Çandar, who is member of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, the Parliament of Turkey, elected with the People's Equality and Democracy Party. He has taught at Istanbul Bilgi University, Istanbul Cultural University, Özyeğin University, and currently he is a distinguished visiting scholar at Stockholm University Institute for Turkish Studies and a senior associate fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Çandar is a columnist for Al Monitor's Turkey Pulse, a journalist since 1976. He is the author of 7 books in the Turkish language, mainly on Middle East issues. He is also the author of Turkey's Mission Impossible, War and Peace with the Kurds, published in 2020. Mr. Çandar, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a pleasure and honor for me having on my right side Adem Uzun and on my left side Hans Lukas Kieser, 2 people which I have known for years, and I have great admiration for both of them. So let me start by reminding you of a cliche we used to pronounce. Without the settlement of the Kurdish question, there will be no democracy in Turkey, or, this is a cliche, or without democracy, there will be no settlement of the Kurdish problem. So it has been a chicken and egg story, which comes first. For me, being a dissident who lived the last 7 years of my life in self-imposed exile outside of Turkey, and now a member of the parliament from the pro-Kurdish party, I can attest to the fact that we have to leave aside this cliche, because one has more priority than the other. It's not a chicken and egg story. Without democracy in Turkey, there can be no resolution of the Kurdish question. So the democracy in Turkey comes first for the settlement of the Kurdish question. And the last decade is a good measure or compass for us to understand why. Because since the year 2015 and 2016, I could tell with confidence that there has been a regime change in Turkey. Turkey is, for the moment, is a proto-fascist regime. a sui generis regime. It's an autocracy with elections and parliament. It has no resemblance of the fascist regimes of the 20th century, which we have seen in between the interwar years, like Germany or Italy or Portugal or Spain. But in its own right, it's a peculiar sui generis case for the 21st century, an autocratic regime with a strong authoritarian / totalitarian tendencies, while having elections, opposition, and parliament functioning. So I underline this sui generis issue, and this has been going on since almost a decade. And in this regime, there is no rule of law, there is no supremacy of law, which I have to remind you that Turkey has been the signatory of the European Human Rights Convention in the year 1954. Then in 1987, it accepted the right of appeal of individuals, which has been the case for the European Court of Human Rights. And now, by the figures of 2023 last year, Turkey is the first in terms of applications to the European Court of Human Rights in terms of human rights violations, by far ahead than Romania, for example, which comes second in terms of human rights violations when we measure through the applications to the court. But in 2012, in order to decrease the number of applications done because of human rights violations to the International Court of Human Rights, Turkey accepted the right of its citizens, right of appeal of individuals to the Turkey's Constitutional Court. And now, when we are in this year of 2024, Turkey is not abiding by any ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, nor its own constitutional court. Turkey's constitution article number 90, which was actually modified by the current government in the year 2004, which accepted the precedence of the international rulings over the national and local courts. But despite this, they don't implement the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights on two symbolic cases which became internationally known. Kavala case is one of them, and Demirtas, who has been the chairman of the party that I represent in the parliament now, they are in prisons since 8 years, and the European Court of Human Rights made rulings in the year 2020 and 21 for the release, and even Turkey's Constitutional Court has rulings in the last 2 years on these two cases, but they are not implemented. Despite the Article 153 of the Turkish Constitution makes it mandatory for the legislative authority, the parliament, for the executive, for the government, and for all the judicial bodies that the rulings of the Constitutional Court are mandatory and has to be implemented. And these rulings of the Turkish Constitutional Court has been published by the official gazette, but they are not implemented. So the executive body does not implement the rulings of its own Constitutional Court and violates the Constitution. So in this sense, there is kind of, it's a philosophical argument that the Turkish regime is not constitutional. This argument can be brought by any time. But all these are related to the Kurdish case, of course, because the regime change that I referred, which came in the year 2015 and 2016, is the result of Turkey's approach, the regime's approach to the Kurdish issue. We had a peace process, a settlement process, what was called in the time, in Turkey, which was abruptly stopped by July 2015. Then already the Kurdish rights were violated. There was a denial of the Kurdish rights in Turkey, and by the stopping of the process to find a peaceful settlement of the Kurdish question, it reflected immediately on the foreign policy. Turkey started to undertake cross-border operations, and it moved into Syria. For what? To stop the self-rule of the Kurds, which had been in place in Syria since the beginning of the Syrian conflict, since the year 2012. So there were three military undertakings. One was in 2016 in August, just a month after the so-called coup attempt in Turkey, which Turkey suspended all kind of legal bindings that it had to. It was an extraordinary situation because of the domestic situation in which the Kurdish rights totally were curtailed. But a month after that, Turkish military moved into Syria under the title of Euphrates Shield Operation. 2 years later, it moved into Afrin under the title of Olive Tree Operation, and it ended the Kurdish self-rule in Afrin and depopulated the Kurdish population and moved Arab and Turkmen into Afrin. And in 2019, another part of Syrian frontier with Turkey has become subject of a Turkish military operation under the name of Peace Spring Operation. So any military operation has these romantic titles, either Olive Tree or Peace Spring, but the issue was to prevent Kurds to have a self-rule, and it went in consistency with the situation of the Kurdish rights in Turkey. So the Turkish foreign policy, which resonated itself, or which put itself through the military operation in Syria and to some extent in northern part of Iraq, was consistent with the Turkish regime's position vis-à-vis its Kurdish citizens in Turkey. So there is consistency of Turkish domestic policies and Turkish foreign policies during this last decade, which I referred as a regime change. And I have to refer, before ending, that the current Speaker of the Turkish Parliament, who was the Deputy Prime Minister in the year 2015, had said that the cost of this question, the Kurdish question, he doesn't call it Kurdish question, but fight against terrorism, is $1.2 trillion for the last 30 years, which means Turkey spent 1,200,000,000,000 US dollars to deal with this issue. So if you choose the military resolution of or the military settlement of the Kurdish question, like the case which has been in Sri Lanka, it cost Turkey that amount of money, and add to this figure $1.2 trillion the last decade also, from the year 2015 2016 to 2024, it's nearly 2 trillion US dollars. And it could be spent much for other the issues in a country like Turkey, which the inflation is rampant, around 60% and even more, and there's a deep economic crisis in the country. So the approach to the Kurdish problem has its economic byproduct as well, which creates political uncertainties for the future of the regime. The last thing I would say, and I would stop, there is hope, of course. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist without having hope. When it comes, what's the hope for Turkey? That in the last elections, it was local elections on March 31st, a couple of months ago, my party, the party that I belong, won almost all the Kurdish dominant provinces of Turkey, around 60-65% of the vote. Among Kurdish, predominantly Kurdish, 13 provinces of Turkey, we won in 11 of them. So we represent the Kurdish people, for sure. And the rest of Turkey, the regime's alliance parties lost. I will give an interesting figure too, that 65% of the gross national product of Turkey, where it is produced, is under the control of the main opposition party, not the party in power. So Turkey, if we look at the future, brings up a very resilient population, which doesn't bow, which resists. And of course, what we need, not only the spirit and the resilience of our own people, but international solidarity. But that international solidarity has to be displayed institutionally, from Council of Europe to European Union to NATO, OECD, all the international organizations that Turkey is a member of. So, of course, the international situation also would be determinant in seeing what future lies ahead of Turkey, like when we have Netanyahu in South, who is representing a very aggressive posture in international politics, and with Putin, who is very much engaged with an aggression in Ukraine. So in between, if you have a person called Recep Tayyip Erdogan as the president of Turkey, the zeitgeist around Turkey seems to serve those autocratic bodies. But if the situation changes in the south of Turkey or in north of Turkey, how the situation regarding the Ukrainian question will take place, and also the result of the American elections in the upcoming year, we would be talking in a much better Turkey, which will be respecting more and more in terms of rule of law and supremacy of law. And I hope that we will not be having a meeting with such a content next year in this time of the next year. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Chandel, for your presentation about the Turkish policy, and highlighting also the fact that executive power does not respect not only international rulings by courts, but even its own constitutional court. And now I think we are going deeper in the analysis of the human rights violations and crimes committed by Turkey with Mr. Adem Uzun, who is a spokesperson for foreign relations of the Kurdistan National Congress. Mr. Uzun had to flee Turkey about 30 years ago and has sought refuge in Western Europe. Mr. Uzun, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So I will try to make a little bit short and speaking about some specific cases But just to compare the situation we are now in, the circumstances in Turkey related, we can compare that in the beginning of the 20th century, where the new Turkish Republic was trying to be established, but they have started to genocide non-Muslims, expel them and kill the Armenians, the Greeks, the Syrians, the Assyrians. All the non-Muslims were being massacred, genocide, or expelled from Turkey, so that new Turkey was established. And now we are living the same with the Muslim Kurds, mostly the Muslim Kurds. They are now faced and genocide, continuous genocide, not only in Turkish part of Kurdistan, in other parts of Kurdistan too. Not only in physical genocide and political genocide and cultural genocide and linguistic genocide and physical genocide, and their land is going to be occupied. And Turkey is not only satisfied to occupy one part of it under their control, they are trying to occupy Syrian part of Kurdistan, Iraqi part of Kurdistan too, and committing war crimes. So when we speak about Turkey, about the Kurdish issue, about the circumstances and the chaos that we have now in the area, of course, the democratization, the stability, the rule of law, human rights, international norms, peace, reconciliation, all of this is interlinked with each other. But unfortunately, none of them is now implemented in Turkey. They do not care on all these norms, on all these rules, or all these values. Everybody, people is. We have now heard from Hans Lucas and Cengiz Çandar how the situation is. I want to focus on a specific case which is related on the fate of millions of people, millions of Kurds, the Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan. Why I am referring to his case? Because there is no rule of law on his case, and also we do not have any news from him since 42 months. He's in prison, but we do not know if he's still there, if he's still alive, how is his well-being. He has no contact with the outside world since 42 months. So Abdullah Öcalan is seen a leader of millions of Kurds as the political representative. In February 1999, in an international intelligence operation, he was abducted and sent to Turkey. He has been in prison ever since, barred from all contacts with the outside world for years at a time. So he has been subjected to torture and other cruel and degrading treatments. So since then, the Turkish state has continued to commit violation against Abdullah Öcalan for over 25 years, starting with an informal trial that resulted in a life sentence. These prosecutions are carried out in complete isolation from the outside world, with no news, like I said. Everything done in the Imrali Island, where Öcalan is kept now, is secret. And a series of continuation disciplinary punishments for more than 3 years based on false justification that do not adhere to any custom or constitution, like Mr. Cengiz Çandar said, even not the Turkish domestic constitution. So, therefore, the Turkish state violates the law and decrees of human rights punishment by the EU, UN, Geneva Conventions, and so known Nelson Mandela's principles. So, and we, the Kurdish people, we are calling the island where Mr. Öcalan is kept, the İmralı Island, as an İmralı regime. When Turkey want to have a new legislation regarding to the prisoners, first they're implementing that against Mr. Abdullah Öcalan, because implementing that against Mr. Abdullah Öcalan will not raise any opposition from the opposition parties, will not raise any opposition from the public opinion, from the press, so they can continue with their violation. After a while, we will see the same violation against other prisoners. Taking this as an example, we spoke about Mr. Kavala, about Mr. Demirtas, and thousands of other prisoners. Everything which is now implemented on law, treatments against them, was first implemented against Mr. Abdullah Öcalan. And because he's seen in Turkey as a very danger, nobody is saying anything, and all the laws are following the situation. There have been a lot of works we've done, we are trying to do to raise the awareness of the public opinion in the West countries. We collected millions of signatures. We collected 10.5 million signatures in Europe. When we have presented these signatures to the Council of Europe, to the Committee Against Torture from the Council of Europe, we have presented them to the UN, to the EU, but none of them has followed up, none of them has made any critic against Turkey because of some political interest, maybe economical interest, maybe military interest. And nowadays, Turkey is blackmailing the European countries with the refugee issue, with the instability, with Daesh, with radical Islam, and with the Turks living here outside Turkey. And unfortunately, these European countries are taking that very serious and keeping silence. There have been a lot of attempts to convince these European institutions to do their work, to follow up their own rules, to go and to visit this İmralı Island, the prisoners, what kind of condition they have. But unfortunately, the silence is still continuing. It was in a meeting just a few weeks here in UN. The Committee Against Torture, CAP, has published a report after this meeting on the Article 16, 17 from the CAP report and Article 48. It is saying very clearly this violation against İmralı Island, against Mr. Abdullah Öcalan, is a violation of international law. He has to be allowed to see his family, to see his lawyers, and the life sentence against him has to be lifted out. And they have given a time period for July 2025. But we are still afraid, is the UN going to follow up that decision? Is UN going to follow up or make some sanctions against Turkey if Turkey doesn't fulfill all these, which I am sure they will not, because 2014, the Human Rights Court for Europe has decided that Turkey has to end the isolation against Mr. Abdullah Öcalan and has to lift out the life sentence and has to give a right for hope even for Mr. Abdullah Öcalan. Since 10 years, the Council of Europe Human Rights Court, CPT, Anti-Torture Committee from Council of Europe, the EU, they didn't follow up their own decision since 10 years. What I'm trying to say, this violation in Turkey against prisoners, against Kurdish leader, is, and the silence on this issue is not helping to solve the Kurdish question peacefully. Turkey is misusing all this silence to go on their genocide against the Kurds and the violation against humanitarian law. And not only this, Turkey has now started to have cross-border military operation to occupy Kurdish areas in Iraq and in Syria, committing war crimes, killing civilians. In the last 10 years, only in Iraqi Kurdistan, they have killed more than 800 civilians, but nobody said anything against it. They have destroyed the infrastructure in northeast Syria, in the Kurdish area. Nobody said something. So my presentation is going that, okay, Turkey is doing that because they are seeing the elimination of the Kurds for their existence very important strategically. They are seeing the Kurds as the enemy, okay. But why the international institutions, international body, international public opinion is still silent, is not acting, and is not following up their own rules, their own decisions? That is what matters now. That is what it's very important now. Because stability in the area, democracy in the area will lead for a better life, for a life without war, for a life for peace, with peace, for life for coexistence. We the Kurds, we are ready to solve our questions within the countries where we live. Turkey is calling always us a separatist. No. We really want to solve the Kurdish question being solved within the borders from that country where the Kurds live, with some constitutional changes, giving the Kurds the same rights what the other nations, minorities, or in that case, the Turks has. It is not about to looking for a new state, Kurdish state. It is not about to have new borders. It is only about democracy, peace, life together, and having their own fundamental rights. It is about that. Because Mr. Abdullah Öcalan is now proposing such a project, Turkey is seeing such a project as a threat against their existence. So therefore they are continuing with this isolation. My call from here is on the UN, follow up their decisions and pushing Turkey to fulfill their obligations related to the international law and norms, and pushing Turkey to end that isolation so the Kurds, millions of Kurds, and the family of Mr. Abdullah Öcalan can get some news from. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Guzun, for your testimony. And now we have some 10 minutes left, and I will open the floor for questions and comments, and please introduce yourself. If there are no questions, I will have a question for Professor Kieser. Mr. Sandar spoke about Turkey being member of regional international organizations like Council of Europe, NATO. And from the historical point of view, how do you see the responsibility of Turkey allies about the human rights violations and crimes against Kurdish people?
Yeah, also, again, I would propose to go back to Lausanne, and a very important moment in Lausanne, at the Lausanne conference, was the moment when the British delegate asked the Turkish plenipotentiary, Ismet Inönü, if they were ready to enter the League of Nations, so to be responsible in an international, in the international, the most important, of course, new international organization of the time. He then, surprisingly for many, especially for the Bolshevik representation, said yes, because he felt cornered by Curzon, was the British plenipotentiary. And then from then, so there was a lot of goodwill, then also Western goodwill to go on with Turkey and to seek a peace that everybody, but especially Europe in deep crisis after the First World War wanted. But, and now that's perhaps the answer, the most important answer, Turkey waited for years and years until it had implemented its own ultra-nationalist construction of a one-party, dictatorial one-party state, before it entered, at the beginning of the 1930s, the League of Nations, when the League of Nations was very weak and didn't have any strong say in terms of minorities and human rights, collective rights, even if the term human rights was not used as such. So yes, historically speaking, there was right from the start, that is at the start is the Conference of Lausanne, a kind of a misuse of the international system, or let's say, you can also say, a clever use of the international system for an ultra-nationalist policy that is recognized by the Western countries in the name of what I call an appeasement avant la lettre, because appeasement is normally then used for what especially Britain did during the 1930s with the Nazis. But appeasement, I would really revise the notion of interwar appeasement and say the crucial birth is the Lausanne Conference.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any questions from the floor. Then maybe I will ask to Mr. Chandar whether the Kurdish issue is discussed in the Turkish parliament, and how.
It is discussed in the Turkish parliament in a very passionate way, actually, because the Turkish parliament is consist of 600 members, deputies, and almost 60 of them is from the party that I represent also in the parliament. We are the third largest parliamentary bloc, and I'm an ethnic Turk myself, but the majority of the members of parliament of my party are Kurds. So nearly, let us say, 40 of them are Kurds. The rest are pro-Kurdish, including myself. So whenever we take the floor,